Chapter 11. Yankee Doodle. So Johnny slept. It was daylight when he woke with Warren's hand upon his shoulder. Outside on Tremont Street he could hear the clumping of army boots. A sergeant was swearing at his men. The soldiers were paraded so close to the house, which stood flush with the sidewalkless street, that Johnny at first thought they must be in the room. Dr. Warren dared speak no louder than a whisper. "I'm going now." "Something's happened?" "Yes." He motioned Johnny to follow him into the kitchen. This room was on the back of the house. They could talk without danger of being overheard by the troops in the street. Dr. Warren had on the same clothes as the day before. He had not been to bed. But now his hat was on his head. His black bag of instruments and medicines was packed on the table. Silently he put milk, bread, herrings beside it, and gestured to Johnny to join him. "Where did it begin?" asked Johnny. "Lexington." "Who won?" "They did. 700 against 70. It wasn't a battle, it was just target practice for them. Some of our men were killed and the British huzzaed and took the road to Concord." "And did they get our supplies there?" "I don't know. Paul Revere sent for me just after the firing on Lexington Green." The young man's usually fresh-colored face was haggard. He knew the seriousness of this day for himself and for his country. "But everywhere the alarm is spreading. Men are grabbing their guns, marching for Concord. Paul Revere did get through in time last night. Billy Dawes a little later. Hundreds, maybe thousands of Minutemen are on the march. Before the day's over, there'll be real fighting, not target practice. But Gage doesn't know that it's begun. You see, long before Colonel Smith got to Lexington, just as soon as he heard that Revere had warned the country, he sent back for reinforcements, for Earl Percy. You and I, Johnny, are just about the only people in Boston who know that blood has already been shed." "Were many killed at Lexington?" "No, not many. They stood up, just a handful. The British fired on them. It was dawn." Johnny licked his lips. "Did they tell you the names of those killed?" "No. Did Rab get out in time?" "Yes, last Sunday." The doctor's clear blue eyes darkened. He knew what was in Johnny's mind. He picked up his bag. "I've got to get to them. They'll need surgeons. Then, too, I'd rather die fighting than on a gallows. Gage won't be so lenient now, soon as he learns war has begun." "Wait until I get my shoes on." "No, Johnny, you are to stay here today. Pick up for me any information. For instance, out of my bedroom window I can see soldiers standing the length of the street way over to the Common. You find out what regiments are being sent, and all that. And today go about and listen to what folk are saying, and the names of any the British arrest. We know Gage expects to move his men back here tonight. If so, there'll be a lot of confusion getting them into town. You watch your chance and slip out to me." "Where'll I find you?" "God knows. Ask about." "I will do so." "They've begun it. We'll end it, but this war, it may last quite a long time." They shook hands silently. Johnny knew that Warren was always conscious of the fact that he had a crippled hand. Everybody else had accepted and forgotten it. The back door closed softly. Warren was gone. Johnny went to the surgery, put on his boots and jacket. The wall clock said 8 o'clock. It was time to be about. There was no leaving by the front door. The soldiers were leaning against it. Through the curtains of the windows he could see the muskets. He noticed the facings on their uniforms. The 23rd Regiment. The narrow course of Tremont Street was filled to the brim and overflowing with the waiting scarlet-coated men. Like a river of blood. He left by the kitchen. 2. On Cornhill, Johnny could feel the subdued excitement. Everyone knew something was happening. No one knew what. Doors and windows were open. People hanging out, calling back and forth, or gathered in knots on the street. Johnny kept his eyes and ears open. Everyone knew about that secret expedition last night. Colonel Smith had embarked with 700 men and landed in Cambridge. That Gage was sending over at least 1,000 fresh troops to support him, anyone might guess. But the people of Boston knew no more than Gage that the fighting had begun. Johnny went to the Province House. All was as usual. The sentries were on guard, young officers lounged about. One was already in his cups. Johnny could see that a group of them were playing at cards in the south parlour. Perhaps they were finishing off the game they had begun last night. He knew which was General Gage's bedroom. The curtains were still drawn. Colonel Smith's early call for reserves evidently had not upset the commanding officer. He had given the order which set Percy's 1st Brigade in motion, had rolled over and gone to sleep. Johnny went to the common. He had already seen the tail of Percy's brigade lashing around Dr. Warren's house. The head of this scarlet dragon lay upon the common. The men were restless, grumbling, spitting, shifting their heavy equipment. Some had already been standing about for 3 hours. Johnny learned from one of their camp women what was causing the delay. They were waiting to be joined by a detachment of Marines. He looked about and saw for himself these 1,200 men were taking with them cannon and baggage wagons. The tension among the inhabitants was growing. What had happened? What was going to happen? Shops and schools were closed, and Johnny met a wreath of tiny children advancing and chanting, "School's done, war's begun." It looked to him they were shrewder guessers than their elders, who were trying to believe that not a shot had been, or would be, fired. Then, from over North Boston way, came the brisk rattle of drums. The 500 Marines, billeted all about North Square, arrived at double quick. They took their places in the ranks. Some were still buckling their equipment or eating the bread that had been tossed to them. They had been hours late, but when they had been notified, they came fast. Tagging after them, looking half awake and half dressed, Johnny recognized an old acquaintance. It was Madge, even fatter since her marriage and seemingly more in love than ever. Tears streamed down her thick red cheeks, and, all old animosity forgotten, she flung herself upon Johnny. "I can't bear it, but he says he's got to go." Nearby, tough little Sergeant Gale was strutting about like a bantam cock, roaring at one of his men whose buttons did not shine. He was pretending not to know that his wife was so nearby. He was really showing off in front of her and approved her presence. Men went to war and women wept. All was as it should be. "Sure, he's got to go," Johnny comforted Madge. "But people say Gage is just sending out the brigade for exercise. They've been sitting about barracks catching fleas all winter." Why were the Marines late? Gage sent a letter to Major Pitcairn telling him to parade his men, but Pitcairn wasn't to home. Pitcairn went off last night, second in command to Colonel Smith. Did you know that? The Marines didn't know until about 10 minutes ago. Johnny had to laugh. It certainly would hearten Dr. Warren when he heard how stupid the British had been. Gage had forgotten the Marine Major had already gone, had sent him a letter, and then turned over for another snooze. Suddenly there was silence along the whole great length of the brigade. Slim Earl Percy on a white horse, escorted by a group of officers, was cantering slowly across the common. 5 mounted men. The sun was bright that day, with only breeze enough to ruffle the horses' manes, flaunt scarlet riding capes, float the flag of England. Johnny was an Englishman. The sullen, rebellious people standing about watching Percy and his staff approaching, waiting for the brigade to march, all were Englishmen. That flag, it stood for Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, Charles I's head upon a block, centuries of struggle for English liberty. But over here there had grown up a broader interpretation of the word liberty. No man to be ruled or taxed except by men of his own choice. But we are still fighting for English liberty, and don't you forget it. French slaves to the north of us, Spanish slaves to the south. Only English colonies are allowed to taste the forbidden fruit of liberty, we who grew up under England. Johnny thought of James Otis's words, upholding the torch of liberty, which had been lighted on the fires of England. Not since the soldiers had come to Boston had Johnny removed his hat when the British flag went by, except once, when it had been knocked off his head by a soldier. He started to remove it now, for the first time and doubtless the last. Thought better of it. It was too late. He knew the shooting had begun. The sword in Earl Percy's hand flashed. There was a command which was instantly picked up and repeated and echoed and repeated again. The regimental drummers struck up. The artillery horses threw their weight against their collars. Wagoners cracked their whips, and the Scarlet Dragon swung forward, sluggishly at first, heading for the town gates. Thousands of separate feet merged into only one gigantic pair. Left, right, left, right. The earth shook to their rhythm. Johnny watched them pass. Every button was sewed on, every buckle in place. Every cartridge box held exactly 36 cartridges. Every musket had a bayonet, and there was not one old fowling piece among them. Every horse had 4 new shoes. It was a magnificent sight, but Johnny felt a little sick. What chance, what shadow of a chance had those poor, untrained, half-armed farmers at Concord? Oh, God, be with us now. But even as he prayed, he kept an eye out for the regimental markings on the men's uniforms. It was the 4th, the 23rd, and the 47th who were being sent out, plus 500 Marines, plus a small artillery train and a few baggage wagons. 1,200 for a guess. The drums throbbed. The heavy dragon marched on its thousands of feet, and now above the drums came the shrilling of fifes. They played a tune they always played when they wished to insult Yankees. For once more Yankee Doodle was going to town on a spanking stallion, and that forlorn feather in his cap, asking those unmilitary questions. Poor Yankee Doodle. Whatever could he do against this great scarlet dragon?
This book is continued on Disc 7.
Johnny Tremain by Esther Forbes. Continued.
Disc 7.
3. The hundreds gathered to see the departure of the brigade stood about gazing at the empty space they had occupied. Far away, growing faint and fainter, came wafting back the last sound of the tune they played. A man, standing by Johnny with clenched hands and head thrust down and out like a bull's, said thickly, "They go out by Yankee Doodle, but they'll dance to it before night." Johnny saw a group of women, and they were nodding their heads, whispering a prophecy. Before night they'll be dancing. This catchphrase was everywhere. It did not seem to have gone from mouth to mouth, but from mind to mind. Old meeting struck 9. Earl Percy and his laggard brigade were gone. This day, this unreal day in which Boston waited hour upon hour for news, any news, good or bad, was well begun. Suddenly people were saying, "Have you heard? At sunrise this morning over at Lexington the British fired on us." No one seemed to know where this rumor had started, but it was everywhere. Although half of Gage's forces had left town for the battlefield, there were more officers than usual hanging about the streets and taverns. And their faces were so bland, and they reassured the people so glibly that not a shot had been fired, not a person killed, and begged all and sundry so smoothly to keep calm and go to their shops or their homes. Johnny was confident that the British, as well as the inhabitants, had heard now the war had begun. And by noon little bands of soldiers appeared on the streets, going quickly from house to house. Too late General Gage had given orders that the leaders of the opposition should be arrested. But the leaders were all gone. The angry, frustrated soldiers might scare Sam Adams' black handmaiden out of her wits. They could break John Hancock's fence. But these gentlemen had quietly left Boston a month before. They stormed into Joseph Warren's house. He was gone, and so was Paul Revere. Not one of the principal leaders was left, and seemingly no rebel printers. Isaiah Thomas's shop was empty. He and his press had left the night before. At Eads and Gill's, where the Boston Gazette was published, they did grab young Peter Eads. His father and press had been smuggled out to Watertown. Robert Newman, suspected of having hung the lanterns in Christ's Church the night before, was thrown into jail, and John Pulling, merely suspected of having helped, was forced to hide in his grandmother's wine butt. Paul Revere's cousin was in jail, and every minute the temper of the soldiers was growing shorter, and a queer feeling of jubilation was apparent among the people. You couldn't see, you couldn't guess, why they began feeling so confident. Confidence was in the air. As soon as Johnny heard that arresting parties were on the streets, he sent a message to Uncle Lorne. Uncle Lorne had best make himself scarce. Soon after, having stood about the jail and noted exactly who was put in it, he himself headed for Salt Lane. There was not a person on the street, but at every window he saw a face. The lane itself had changed. He glanced about him and saw what was wrong. There was no little man in a blue coat observing Boston through a spyglass. The familiar sign had been torn down, stamped to kindling. The door of the shop was shattered. He went in. The presses were broken, the type pied. Upstairs, his and Rab's bed had been ripped open by bayonets. Frightened, he ran across the street. Aunt Jennifer sat in her kitchen. Half in her lap and half on the floor was an enormous feather bed. She was peacefully sticking on it a new ticking. The only unusual thing was the great number of feathers this deft housewife had carelessly spilled over her kitchen floor. Rabbit, enchanted with these new toys, was constantly picking up a feather, putting it in his hair, and saying, "Yankee do." "They've been here?" asked Johnny. "Yes." "Are they gone?" "Not one in sight." "We got your message just as they were turning down Salt Lane." The feather bed began to heave on the floor. "You can come out now," Aunt Jennifer whispered to it. Out of the bottom rolled Uncle Lorne, choked with feathers and looking more bird than human. Rabbit shrieked, "Dada!" He evidently thought his father much improved. Still trembling, for Uncle Lorne was a timid man, he kissed his wife and hugged his child. "It was all I could think of," Aunt Jennifer said to Johnny. "Mr. Lorne just stood here and said he wasn't afraid to die. We could hear the men marching down the street. It was terrible. So I just popped him in and went on sewing." "Were the soldiers rough?" "Rough! They were furious." "Good," said Johnny grimly. "That means they are really scared." "Something pretty awful has happened to all those men Gage has sent out. Some of the officers may know already, but the men have guessed it, and they are running about with uniforms unbuttoned and yelling, 'If they want a war, we'll give it to 'em, and they won't pay taxes, we'll collect in blood.'" "You don't say! Are you sure the fight's going for us?" "Pretty sure. I was down by the ferry slip and saw a British major coming over from Charlestown. Well, he had a civilian coat over his uniform, sort of disguised. And he tore off the boat and ran for the Province House. He'd come to tell Gage Colonel Smith's and Percy's men are getting licked." "Boy, you're jumping at conclusions." "Not I. I saw his face. It was just done in and tied up with disgust. His uniform was a mess. His feelings had been hurt. People who have been winning battles don't go around with faces like that, but British officers who have been beaten by peasants and yokels do." "Oh, Johnny, I do like to hear you talk like that, but I'm not counting much on one man's face. Where are you off to?" "Beacon Hill. I've an idea that Major got back to Gage to tell him one thing. The British are going to try to get to Charlestown just the way he did, and under protection of the Somerset's guns. They won't backtrack the way they came. Too dangerous. If I've guessed it right, before long from Beacon Hill we'll be able to see them, running, and our men after them. Johnny, here's half a mince pie for you. You're a real smart boy." Uncle Lorne came back from the bedroom where he, with Rabbit's help, had been picking off feathers. "Even if they hang me," he said in a proud tremolo, "I will feel I have not lived in vain." He was still pretty scared. Out on the street, Johnny met officers yelling at their men, trying to get them back into their barracks, striking at them even with the flat of their swords. You couldn't say the British regulars lacked fight. All they could talk about was how many skulking cowards and damned rebels they were going to kill. In one day, all was changed in Boston. On both sides the gloves were off and the hands underneath were bloody. War had begun. The pastures and orchards back of Beacon Hill were crowded, and all eyes turned northward. Johnny was not the only person who had guessed that Percy would not attempt to get the remains of Smith's troops and his own brigade back through Cambridge, but only to Charlestown, where they could be protected by the Somerset's guns. Then Johnny saw running down Cambridge Road through the bushes on Charlestown Common a scurry of red ants. Had he really seen them or imagined them? But all about him people were exclaiming, "Look! There they are!" Those red ants were British soldiers. To his left, the last moment of sunlight was dying. The day had been amazingly warm, but with night a fresh breeze came up off the ocean. Lights began to glimmer in Charlestown and on warships. Seemingly, there was nothing more to be seen from Beacon Hill. Silently, people turned to go to their houses. "Look!" Johnny cried. You could see the flash of musket fire, too far away to be heard. Fireflies swarming, hardly more than that. 4. Getting 2,000 men, or what was left of them, for gossip was saying they had been well chewed, into boats and back to Boston would create just the confusion Dr. Warren had promised. But it would not be easy for Johnny to slip over. The soldiers were cross and frightened. He would wait a little until they were more relaxed. Say about midnight. Before him, lighted from top to bottom, he saw the Lights' house and he remembered Pumpkin's uniform. Dressed in that, he might slip aboard in the confusion. He went to the Lights. In front of the house he saw wagons and carts and men loading them with furniture, chests, trunks, boxes, even old portraits. The Lights were moving, and by night, and in a hurry. He went to the kitchen door. Mrs. Bessie, who certainly ought to have been superintending this moving, was sitting idly in the kitchen, doing nothing. Cilla sat beside her. She was doing nothing. Mrs. Bessie jerked her thumb toward the front of the house. "Scared?" she said. "They are all going to London until this insurrection, as they call it, is over. The Unicorn leaves at dawn tomorrow. Gage has given permission." "Cilla," said Johnny, "don't you go with them." "Never. We all had a terrible fight this afternoon when word first came to us that Yankees had beaten them hollow. All the other servants are Tories and are going with them. But Mrs. Bessie and I are Whigs, and we are not going with them. In the end, Mr. Light said he was glad we are Whigs because he will leave us here to look after his property. Gage has promised nothing up here will be touched." "But they don't want us around, can't bear the sight of us," Mrs. Bessie said smugly. "The very sight of a good Whig makes them furious. Mr. Light did have another fit, just a little one. Miss Lavinia is afraid if she doesn't get her papa right out of town and off to London, he'll die. She always did like London better than Boston anyway. They are leaving tonight, and fast." "What's Isana going to do?" "Izzy?" Mrs. Bessie's lips curled. "She'll go with them." "She will not," said Cilla. "Miss Lavinia has gone down to Hancock's Wharf to ask Ma to let her take her. But Ma couldn't give her away, just as though she was a kitten." Miss Lavinia was standing in the doorway from the dining room to the kitchen. She had on a black cloak with the hood to it over her head. She stood a moment looking about and said nothing. Johnny was on his feet. He knew he would never forget her. Never. Even when he was an old man, he would remember Lavinia Light, standing, framed in that doorway, saying nothing. Her eyes were angry and tired. The chisel mark was deep between the low-sweeping black brows. He had never seen her look so worn and old, and never before been more aware of her beauty. "Isana is going with me," she said at last. "Your mother, Cilla, has too many kittens." "Miss Lavinia," said Cilla, "you can't do that." "Can't? Your mother signed the paper, and you're a wicked girl to stand in the way of your sister's good fortune." A little diffidently, Isana herself emerged from behind the lady's great dark skirts. "Isana," said Cilla gently, "you can't go off and leave me like this. It's no matter what Mother says. Look, dear, if you go to London, maybe you will never come back. Isana, don't go away from me." Lavinia was smiling under her dark hood. "I will leave the decision entirely to her. She shall be perfectly free to choose between us. Precious, would you rather go with me to London and be a great lady and wear silks and jewels and ride in coaches, or stay here and be just another poor working girl?" And then, to make the choice doubly hard for the child, she added a little maliciously, "Which do you love most, Cilla or me?" Still Isana said nothing. But even in her silence, Johnny could detect something of her desire for drama. At the moment, silence was more dramatic than anything she could say. "Izzy is no good," thought Johnny. "She'll go." Cilla was standing quietly, well away from the child. She was too proud to make any further appeal to her. Perhaps, like Johnny, she knew what the answer would be. "Well," said Lavinia, "I haven't got all day. Which do you love the most?" Isana began to cry. It was perfectly natural crying. Not even Johnny could believe it was done for effect. "I don't know," she sobbed. "Which would you rather be, a common person like your sister or a fine lady?" "Fine lady," she sniffled, and went on dreamily. "And I'll have a gray pony and a pony cart. I've got the gold locket already." Her hand went to her throat. Next she'd be saying she wanted a little sailboat. Even now she was only reflecting old desires of Scylla's. Isana never could think up anything for herself. "Yes, dear, you will, when I am Lady Prior Morton and you my little protégé." She explained to the others, "I've been betrothed to marry my lord ever since I last came back from London. Papa is a very sick man. He could never live through a civil war over here, never. He doesn't want to leave all his property to the mob, but what does it matter? My lord is so rich. This miserable house, our ships, shops are nothing to him. And my lord never liked it that my papa was in trade. Until now, papa would not give up his trade, nor could I bear to leave him." She turned to Scylla, "And I promise you, I will be in a position to give your sister the best care and training." "Training," said Johnny. "What's she going to be trained for?" "Isana shall be an actress. I would have been myself, but my station in life prevented me. And then I am too tall. And besides, I can't act. Isana shall be the toast of London. You'll be proud some day. Even over here in this dreary wilderness, you shall hear her name and boast that you once knew her." Mrs. Bessie said smartly, "I'd welcome the day I was proud to know that, Izzy." Scylla was not taking the parting as hard as Johnny would have expected. Now he knew that she had been through the worst of it months before when first the two sisters had come to the lights. She had lost Isana long ago. "Now, Scylla," said Miss Lavinia, "I want you to have some time alone with Isana. You've been a good girl, Scylla, better than Isana. But happens she is what I fancy. Now go with her and help her pack her duds." Scylla said nothing, but curtsied and went upstairs with Isana, who was once more sobbing. "You too," said Lavinia irritably to Mrs. Bessie. "You leave me, for I must talk to Johnny alone." Mrs. Bessie heaved herself up out of her comfortable chair and shut the door after her. The young woman sat at last and murmured, more to herself than to Johnny, "I must talk to you, Jonathan Light Tremaine." Johnny raised his eyes in amazement. "I wanted to tell you before we left. First of all, Papa never meant to trick you out of your cup. He honestly thought it was an attempt at swindle. I mean that someone here in Boston stole the cup and then found a boy to pretend to be a long-lost relative, and used the cup as proof. Your mother did leave Boston with one of those cups. Papa did not mention that fact in court. There really were 5. He implied no more than 4 ever came to this country." "He didn't imply it," said Johnny. "He swore it in court." Oh, well, what of it? Let me talk. You see, he never knew that his niece, Vinnie Light, had a child. He had it from your father's family that both she and her husband died of cholera almost as soon as they reached Marseille. You see, your father was a naval surgeon, a prisoner of war, while here in Boston. Oh, nothing very much," she added scornfully. "No great fortune or title. And Vinnie Light fell in love with him. He was everywhere in society that year, although a prisoner of war, and of course the Lights wouldn't hear of a marriage. He a Frenchman and a Catholic. And they told her if she ran off with him she would be cut off, and she was never to return. But she did. Vinnie was so wild she went right ahead. A ship's captain married them. Then his family, of course, would have none of her, she being a heretic. And then he died. They sent word to Papa, your grandfather was dead, that both had died. But his family sent Vinnie to a convent, hoping the sisters would convert her, and there, 3 months after your father died, you were born. You were born in a convent in the south of France. Odd, isn't it? Why do you call my mother Vinnie? We all did. Vinnie Light, the wildest, handsomest girl in Boston. I was only a schoolgirl, but she was so beautiful and so gay. Oh, if you could have but seen her. But I did. He remembered the sweet, sad face of his sick mother. Was the wild and beautiful Vinnie Light really the same woman? His mother patiently sewing and sewing to keep life in her son's body. She wanted no more life for herself, teaching him to read, making him those smocks. Knowing she had changed so much in such few years, she dared as Mrs. Tremaine return to Boston so her boy could grow up there, learn a decent trade. He thought of her agreeing with Mr. Lapham for his indenture, smiling as she told him that when she died he was to go there. "When I first saw you," Miss Lavinia went on, "I noticed one thing, but it set me thinking. I did nothing for a while, but this spring I asked one of my father's captains, bound for Marseille, to feel about and find out the truth. I did so behind Papa's back. Papa was already too ill to be bothered, but I knew he would want to do right. Like swearing in court there never were but 4 light cups?" She colored angrily. "Please let me do the telling. Don't you dare criticize the best man ever lived." Johnny had his own opinion on that. "What was the one thing?" he asked. "The way your hair turns down upon your forehead, that little peak. She was a dark girl. That widow's peak on her was very striking. And then that day in Mr. Dana's court. I did notice you walked like her, light and wild like a panther or," she shrugged, "maybe only like a tomcat. I admired my cousin so, I may tend to exaggerate her qualities." "And what did your captain find out?" "What I have just told you. And one thing more. Your father, the naval surgeon, was ashamed to be a prisoner of war. He told folks here his name was Latour. That's why your name Tremaine meant nothing to us." "That is my true name?" "Yes. But I haven't much time to talk. Only yesterday I told Papa. He's too ill to speak to you himself. He does want you to know that he did not deliberately cheat you, steal your cup. Mother did take it with her." "Yes. It belonged to her, and her maid, Mrs. Denny, went with her. It was Margaret Denny who got her and you out of the convent and onto a ship her brother commanded, and so to Townsend, Maine. That's where I grew up. I remember Aunt Margaret. She died just before Mother took me to Boston." "Yes, and Papa says I am to promise you that he will write the whole thing out in black and white. When the war's over," she shrugged, "you can put in quite a claim for property, if there's any property left, which I doubt. Anything more you wish to ask me?" "Yes. What relationship are you to me? What ought I to call you?" She laughed out loud. "Mercy, I don't know. What am I? Why, I suppose I'm sort of a cousin, but you'd better call me Aunt Lavinia." He said it tentatively. "Aunt Lavinia?" You couldn't even secretly have a romantic passion for an aunt. The queer hold she had had on him for a year snapped. She went to Johnny, stretched out a hand, and touched the widow's peak, all that he had ever got from the beautiful Vinny Light. Then she was gone. 5. Johnny almost forgot the principal reason for his visit to the lights. He would have liked to sit quietly for a moment, brood over what Miss Lavinia had told him. Now was not the time to brood. Cilla and Mrs. Bessie came back together. He told them he must have Pumpkin's uniform. Mrs. Bessie said he was not to think of such a thing. "If they catch you, Johnny, they will shoot you for impersonating a British soldier in wartime." Lots of better men got shot today, Lexington conquered. The British are sending boats back and forth tonight, taking off their men from Charlestown. I can sneak along over with them. "No, I forbid you, Johnny. You're going to stay right here and help Cilla and me look after this house." "I've got to go." "Who's going to look out for the light horses if you walk out on us? General Gage has given his word no person or horse or any household gear will be touched, but we need a man to mind the stable." Johnny had an idea. "Cilla, there is a thing you can do for me." "What?" "Go to the Afric Queen and get my goblin. Take him up here and turn him out to pasture with the light horses. I guess he won't mind being a Tory for a while." "Can I ride him?" "Yes, if you don't mind falling off." "I don't mind." She looked excited and pleased. Mrs. Bessie shook her head. "And who's to care for the animals? You adding your goblin makes things worse, not better for us two women folk. The coachman's going with the lights? Of course, he's English-born. Look here, Mr. Lorne, the printer, he's not what you'd call a coachman, but he was reared on a farm and he's in trouble. British haven't arrested him yet. He hid in a featherbed, but he can't stay there until we've driven the British out of Boston. Couldn't he and his wife and child move up here into the coachman's quarters and you sort of act as though he had always worked here? Of course they could. I'd be proud to have them. Scylla, just as soon as the Unicorn sails, you go to the Lornes, you tell them to come right up and settle in. The girl nodded. Johnny said, if he can get his little press to working again, I think he might like to bring that with him. Go on with his sedition, as they call it. He just about has to print. We can hide his press, too. Nobody would dare hunt here for sedition, not after what Gage promised. He'll be a very happy man, and now I've got to go. Syl, where's that uniform of Pumpkin's? I hid it under my bed. I'll fetch it down. Mrs. Bessie shook her head, but she wasn't going to argue any more. How old are you, Johnny? She asked. 16. And what's that? A boy or a man? He laughed. A boy in a time of peace and a man in a time of war. Well, men have got the right to risk their lives for things they think worth it. God go with you, my young man. But if they shoot you, remember, I warned you. I'll remember all right. Pumpkin had been a little stouter than Johnny. The uniform went on easily over the boy's breeches and jacket. Mrs. Bessie braided his hair for him and tied it tightly as the British regulars wore theirs. You couldn't say, could you, Scylla asked him, why it is you have to get out tonight? Yes, Dr. Warren told me to. Told me things to watch for and report on to him. I've got to find him. And Rab. Rab? The girl's voice sounded frightened. He was with the Lexington men. They stood up at dawn and the regulars killed quite a few of them. Oh, but Rab! Johnny did not answer immediately. He was sitting at the kitchen table and Mrs. Bessie was still fussing with his hair. Not once since Dr. Warren had left had he spoken his name. He hadn't dared to let himself begin thinking about him. If he did, he knew he could not think of anything else. Now he had spoken his name, and emotions, fears that he had held in check all day surged up through him. But he said quietly, I've got to find him. So be a good girl, Syl, and mind Mrs. Bessie. He stood up and put on a shiny black hat with a silver cockade on it and saluted smartly. He knew that the last man to wear this uniform had been shot for putting it off, and there was a chance he'd get shot for putting it on. The scarlet tunic with its pale blue facings, the white crossbands on his chest, the white breeches, made him feel like a different person. Now he was a private of the King's Own. He felt confident and happy. And Rab? Of course he was all right. You couldn't kill a fellow like Rab with just a handful of bullets. He shook hands with Mrs. Bessie and, because his uniform had made him feel grown up, he kissed Scylla goodbye just as he had the Sunday before seen Rab kiss his aunt. Not at all like a child being kissed by female relatives. But Scylla said mischievously, Why, I feel as if I was kissing Pumpkin. So Johnny stalked off down Beacon Hill with the proper martial strut. The littler they are, he thought, the more they strut. The physical act of strutting lifted his spirits, made him feel bigger than he was. Of course, that was why the little fellows do it. And he wondered what had happened to Sergeant Gale.